One of the biggest events in history, at least in the last, say, 3,000 years, was the Punic War. Now, the Punic War was a war that was fought between the Romans and the Carthaginians. And Carthaginians was this group of people who had built a very advanced civilization in the northern part of Africa, especially around the region we know today as Libya and maybe Tunisia. So this war started early, or we can say maybe 220s BCE, and it went on for a while. Now, in today's video, we are going to look at a certain story that happened within that war, and a story that was to a large extent shaped by the war that was going on between the Romans and the Carthaginians. It's important to point out that the war between the Romans and the Carthaginians involved so many other nations. It wasn't just these two fighting, but so many other nations, especially in the Italian peninsula, were forced to decide whether to be on the side of the Romans or on the side of the Carthaginians. Now, in today's video, we are going to look at a city-state that was known as Syracuse. Now, Syracuse was located in the island we know as Sicily, which is to the southern part of the Italian peninsula. It was one of the most advanced city-states, and it was a city-state that was founded and was occupied by the Greeks. It was one of the several cities that were founded by the Greeks in Sicily and around that part of the Italian peninsula. Now, during the Punic War, when Hannibal had attacked Rome and was carrying out this campaign, and he was trying to conquer Rome, the person ruling Syracuse was a guy who went by the name Hiero. Now, Hiero had ruled this city for close to 60 years. By the time he was leaving power, it was about 60 years of being in power. Now, very early on in his reigning period, Hiero did form an alliance with the Romans. And when the Punic War started, he definitely went on the side of the Romans, and he chose to be on that side. Now, when he was about 90 years old, he figured out that his last days were near. So he decided to put his affairs in order. And one of the things he had to look at is how Syracuse was going to be ruled after he had gone. And the person who was going to become the next king was his grandson. And this grandson was around 15 years. His name was Hieronymus. Now, Hieronymus was this young man who seemed to have liked having fun and maybe being in a crowd that would largely maybe mislead him. And that's what his grandfather might have noticed, because towards the end of his life, he was worried, and Livy writes that at such an age and with such a temperament, guardians and friends alike sought to plunge him into every kind of excesses. Hiero, it is said, seeing what was going to happen, was anxious at the close of his long life to leave Syracuse as a free state, lest the kingdom which had been acquired and built up by wise and honorable statesmen should go to ruins by being made the sport of a boy tyrant. So seems like Hiero saw this young man was likely going to be a tyrant, and he decided to do something about it. He wrote a will, and in the will he picked several people who were going to form like a council that was going to help this young man manage the city. Now, among the people who were going to be part of this council were two son-in-laws of Hiero. They had married his daughters. One was called Andranodorus and another one was called Xippus. Now, this group of 15 people was not accepted immediately, especially by the immediate family. That is, especially the two daughters of the king was about to pass on. The two daughters were not happy, and these two daughters were married to these two guys I've mentioned. And they were not happy that their father was going to form a group or a committee or a commission to oversee the affairs of the city. And they preferred that the young boy should be let to become the next king with all the powers of the king. But they had anticipated that once that happened, because he was still very young, the two sisters and their husbands were going to basically be the power. The boy would just be happy to have the crown and be called the king, but they figured out that the boy was not going to rule, to have the real power, and the real power was going to go to them. Now, but the grandfather, Hiero, created this document, but immediately after he was dead and the boy was put in place as the next king, they conspired in such a way that they made everybody who had been appointed to be part of this team to resign. And once everybody resigned, these sisters and their husbands basically became the power behind the power. And meanwhile, the young man became very arrogant. He was not reachable by the people. He started treating people with a lot of contempt. Livy writes that it was very few people, it was only the sisters and their husbands who had access to him and a few of his young friends. Something else to mention is that Livy tells us that when the king passed on, he wasn't mourned by his family. Seems like the family was more interested in power, and in fact, Livy tells us that it was mostly the people who mourned him, the subjects, because it happened that for the 60 years that he had ruled, he had been a very good king to the people, and the people loved him a lot. And when he died, they genuinely mourned, but his family did not. This is what Livy writes. He says, "Then followed the king's funeral, which was honored more by the love and affection of his subjects than by any grief amongst his own kindred." So his own children, his own grandson, and family in general did not really feel the loss. They were more lost in fighting to grab the power. That's what Livy tells us. As I've mentioned, the sisters, the daughters of the late king, managed to get rid of the 15 people who had been appointed to help the young king rule. And now they were basically the ones ruling, holding the real power. Meanwhile, the young man was basically doing things that the people had not seen being done by a king. He was arrogant, as I've mentioned, but he was almost immediately he did something that made people realize that indeed there was change. This was a very different monarch. This is what Livy writes. "Those who had for many years seen Hiero and his son Gelo going about with nothing in their dress or other marks of royalty to distinguish them from the rest of their countrymen, now saw Hieronymus clad in purple, wearing a diadem, surrounded by an armed escort, and sometimes even proceeding from his palace in a chariot drawn by 4 white horses, after the style of Dionysus the tyrant." So seems like Hiero had been a very humble king. He didn't use all these things or surround himself with all this symbolism of power. He didn't do that. But this young man did that. And that was initially a surprise to the people, but it quickly became a disappointment. And later on, we'll see this was not going into the right direction. The place it was going was a place that was going to be more dangerous to this young man and also for the entire family. But what made the people to be even more or to dislike him even more was the way he treated them, the contempt and the things he would do to them because he thought that they were not important. Maybe this is what Livy writes. "Quite in harmony with his extravagant assumption of state and pomp was the contempt he showed for everybody, the insolent tone in which he addressed those who had sought audience of him, the way he made himself difficult of access not only to strangers, but even to his guardians, his monstrous lusts, his inhumane cruelty." So these are the things that he started doing, and without knowing, he was putting himself or alienating himself from the people. And this was going to end very badly for him, and indeed it did end badly for him, and not only for him, but also for his family. So besides Androdorus and Soipas, who were sons-in-law of the late king, there was this other third person who often had access to the king, and his name was Thraso. Now, Thraso plays a significant role in the story that emerges later. And what happens later is that a conspiracy is discovered that there were people who were planning to murder the young king because they thought that he was becoming a tyrant. The person who discloses this conspiracy to the king is a guy who went by the name Carlo. Now, Carlo was also a young man. He was like 15, 16 years old. He was a friend of the young king. They grew up together, and it happened that this Carlo was not from a noble family, was just from an ordinary family, but somehow he ended up becoming very close friends with the young king. Now, while maybe mingling with the people, he gets to hear of a plan to get rid of the king. And he brings this report to the king, his friend, and he tells him that there is a conspiracy to have you killed. And he gives him a name of one of the conspirators, and one of the conspirators was a guy who went by the name Theodatus. Now, Theodatus is brought before the young king, and he's interrogated. He is asked to tell them who the other conspirators were. And the person who is given the responsibility to make this Theodatus speak is Andronodorus, who is the uncle of the young king, the husband of one of the daughters of the late king. Now, he takes him somewhere, he tortures him a lot. Livy tells us this person goes through a lot of torture. This torture, of course, is meant to make him give up names. And when the pain was a lot or too much for him, he did give up a name. But he doesn't give up any name of the other conspirators. What he does, he picks up or he gives up the name of Thraso. Now, Thraso was one of the 3 people who had access to the king most of the time. But this Thraso guy was not, in fact, a part of the conspiracy. And Thraso happened to have been, of the 3 people who usually met the king, he was the one who was pushing Syracuse to align itself with the Romans, like the late king had established. The late king had established a very good relationship between Syracuse and Rome. But the other 2 people who were the uncles of the young king preferred that Syracuse aligns itself with Hannibal. So Thraso is eliminated that way. It doesn't seem like this Theodatus had planned that he wanted to get rid of Thraso so that Syracuse aligns itself with Hannibal. That could have been the case, but Livy doesn't tell us that was the case anyway. It seems like it was he just picked a name because they were torturing him, and he thought, I'm not going to give up names of the actual conspirators. I'm going to give up a name of, he just thought of any name and he gave up that name of Thraso. Now, when Thraso is eliminated, Syracuse basically aligns itself with Hannibal. Now, that was a huge change of policy, foreign policy for the city, because for 50 years under Hiero, Syracuse had aligned itself with Rome. But at this point, when the Punic War is ongoing, Syracuse decides to go with Hannibal, decide to align itself with Hannibal. So when Rome heard that Syracuse was aligning itself with Hannibal, they did send some ambassadors to come and speak to the young king and try to persuade him to change his mind and maybe to align himself with the Romans. But the way they were received, it wasn't in a way that ambassadors were usually received in any state that they were sent to. This is what Livy writes about that. When they announced that they had come to renew the alliance which had existed with his grandfather, they were laughed at. And as they were leaving, the king asked them in jest what fortune they had met with in the Battle of Cannae. For he could hardly believe what Hannibal's envoys told him. He wanted to know the truth so that he might make up his mind which course to follow as offering the best prospects. The Romans say that they will come back to him when he had learned to receive embassies seriously, and after warning him rather than asking him not to abandon their alliance lightly, they departed. So these ambassadors come and they are laughed at and they are not treated with any respect. And the young king tries to ask them a question about their performance at the Battle of Cannae, where the Romans, I think, lost. The Roman ambassadors told him, we'll come back when you've learned how to receive embassies. It seems that you don't know what you're doing. And so they warned him against aligning himself with Hannibal, and they left. And it seems like even Hannibal saw this young boy as not knowing what he was doing, but he just decided to use him. This is what Livy writes. Puffed up by the flattery of people who told him to remember not only Hiero but his maternal grandfather King Pyrrhus, Hieronymus sent a second legation to Hannibal to tell him that he thought it only fair that the whole of Sicily should be ceded to him and that Carthage should claim the empire of Italy as their own. They expressed neither surprise nor displeasure at this fickleness and levity in the hot-headed youth, provided only they could keep him from declaring for Rome. So the Carthaginians seems like they saw this young man like he doesn't know what he's doing really, but they decided they just going to play along and don't make him move to the side of the Romans. But they basically thought he wasn't capable of being a leader of Syracuse, but they thought he was useful at that point to them. But soon the conspiracy did happen, or the conspiracy did achieve its goals. The people who had conspired to have him killed had still continued to plan this, even though one of them had been arrested and had been tortured and had been killed. But he did help them by not giving up their names. He gave up a name of a person who was not even involved, and then they continued planning. And at some point, Livy describes a situation where they set him up and they have him killed. Now, when he's dead, Andronodorus, his uncle, grabs power. The conspirators were slow in capturing the power, so this uncle of the king who had just been murdered kind of like grabbed power for a moment. He didn't declare himself a king, but he kind of like started, of course, running the city. But when the conspirators arrived in the city, because where they had murdered the king was outside the city, he ran into the citadel and hid himself there. And he had supplies of food and weapons, and seems like he was really ready to defend himself. But then the conspirators seemed like they decided on a different plan. They decided to bring him out by making him feel comfortable and making him not feel threatened. So when these conspirators come to the city, Livy gives us two names of the ones who come to the city, that is Theodotus and Sosis. This could be a different Theodotus, not the one who was tortured, or could be the same, because my assumption was that he died, because Livy doesn't tell us when during the torture he was dead or not. Could be that he didn't die or he died, and this is a different one. But they come to the city and then they called the Senate to a meeting. The Senate had never met since the death of the previous king, the king who had ruled for 60 years, Hiero. And for the first time, the Senate was summoned, and they come to this meeting, and then they talk, and then these conspirators persuade them to call Andronodorus to come out of the citadel. And indeed, he did come out of the citadel when he was assured that he wasn't in danger or anything. And he comes out and he hands over the keys to the gates of the city, which was symbolically like he had given up the power to these conspirators. But before he did that, in fact, his wife had attempted to persuade him not to do that. She went by the name Dimarata. Dimarata had told him not to give up power so easily, because power is not given. It should be taken by force. This is what Livy writes. But his wife, Dimarata, a daughter of Hiero, with all the spirit of a princess and the ambition of a woman, called him aside from the envoys and reminded him of an oft-quoted saying of Dionysius the tyrant, that one ought to relinquish sovereign power when dragged by the heels, not when mounted on a horse. So basically, you don't just give out power like that. You let them take it by force. But anyways, he didn't take that advice. He gave up the power. But then that maybe was not the best decision. That maybe was not the best decision to take, because not long after, maybe a few weeks or months, he was murdered alongside his wife and his sister-in-law, and the rest of the Hiero family were eliminated. And that was the end of the young king who could not handle power and ended up leading the entire family being eliminated. If you found this video interesting, subscribe, and you can leave me a comment, and I'll take a moment to reply to those comments. See you next.